Today I'm speaking with Grant Shaw. Grant owns the largest gun range in the United States called The Range at Austin. Grant is also the target of ATF legislation aimed specifically at shutting down his controversial pistol brace company, SB Tactical. As a result, Grant has become a lightning rod for gun controversy in the United States, rivaling only the NRA. Even if you dislike or are ambivalent towards guns, it was a useful conversation to have. Who better to discuss the ATF's case, the history of the Second Amendment, how guns are portrayed in Hollywood, responsible gun ownership, and the media's role in mass shootings than Grant himself? So, without additional delay, please enjoy my conversation with Grant Shaw.
Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have with me a very good friend of mine, Grant Shaw.
Well, I'm honored to be called a very good friend of yours, Robert.
Yeah, well, I embellish sometimes. So
now that sounds more in line with what I would expect.
So Grant is interesting for a number of reasons. We're going to be talking a lot about the Second Amendment today and gun rights. And but before I get into the specifics of what we're going to talk about, is one of the funnier stories about hanging out with you. I don't know if you remember this, but
Oh dear.
We were at a pool one day and just kind of chilling. I think we're having a beer or whatever. And I only knew you from this gun range that you own, which happens to be the biggest gun range in the United States.
In the United States.
All right, just happens to be. So that's where I knew you from, and that's pretty much all I knew about you. We're just getting to know each other kind of thing. And then you're like, oh, well, I also do this other thing. I have this other company. I'm like, oh, what is that? What is it? SB Tactical. No, never heard of it. Don't know anything about it. What does it do? And you started explaining what you do, and my brain practically melted sitting right there in front of you. I seriously could not believe what I was hearing because I knew everything about you and your company. I just didn't know your name or the company's name. I'd only been looking at the law stuff that was going on and all the stuff that was around it and everything everyone was saying about it.
I recalled that. I think it was the W pool. And,
yeah, it was.
It was refreshing because you were so well versed on, what is an area that I'm pretty deep into.
Yes, no kidding.
And I remember that day. That was a good day and the beginning of a great friendship.
The surprise you saw on my face was a legitimate, oh my God, I cannot believe I'm sitting in front of the person who I've been reading all about. That was very, very surprising because normally it's the other way around. Now, normally I know who I'm talking to and it's sort of like, oh, also I do these little things. Like, no. So your little thing was enormous.
That's what she said.
So you have a very cool company, which I'm going to get to in a second. But I want to talk a little bit about this product first and before we start talking about the controversy.
Sure.
So the way I would describe this, and I'd love to hear how you describe it, is this turns a rifle into a pistol.
I would kind of reframe it in the context of it takes the way a firearm is defined. If it's a pistol, it keeps it as a pistol, but it makes the pistol more accurate, more consistent in terms of how you shoot it. It makes it a more enjoyable experience. Really, a large frame pistol, as it stands in its sort of native capability, isn't all that much fun to shoot. You put a brace on, and it's not very manageable, especially when you're shooting a larger caliber like 5.56, something like that. But you put a brace on it, and again, there's a story behind how we kind of got to where we were. But it changes the usability of the firearm and makes that pistol something that's fun to shoot and something that you can be fairly accurate with as well.
So the idea being you can shoot it with one hand.
Correct.
So if I had a potentially very, very long, big gun, I could theoretically put this on there and use it as a pistol.
Yeah, and if you recall, kind of the genesis of my business partner, Alex, who had this idea, was that I met him at a gun range, which is great. I like to meet people at gun ranges. Could have been someplace else, but that's great. When Alex's story was that he had been at a gun range earlier that week with a friend of his that he had served with in Afghanistan. That individual suffered the loss of an arm and a leg from an IED, and part of his recovery process was wanting to shoot an AR-15 again. So my business partner or my friend Alex at the time took his friend to the range and found very quickly to what you were just saying, that wielding a rifle caliber pistol without any sort of brace or stock is difficult to do. And so much so that the range safety officer at that particular range came over and said, you're not shooting in a safe fashion. I can't allow you to shoot because you've got a lot of recoil that's happening that you're trying to manage.
It's also quite heavy.
It's quite heavy as well. And
even for a strong person.
Even for a strong person. I don't know how Stallone did that in Rambo.
A lot of takes.
A lot of takes with that M60 because that's a heavy gun.
And steroids.
That too. Alex really kind of took affront at this notion that, hey, here's this guy trying to get back to where he wanted to be. And just because he couldn't manage shooting this gun in a controlled fashion, the controlled way that he would like to do it, was, asked to leave a shooting range. So he kind of took the concept of the wrist rocket, which was a slingshot from when I was a kid. That had a bifurcated flap that went over the wrist that became a stabilizing point for the slingshot. But when you look at doing it for a gun, it's the same sort of principle. You take that, what looks like a stock, and we make most of our braces to look like stocks from an aesthetic standpoint, but it has a bifurcated flap that allows us to open it, put it over the wrist, tighten it down. And when you do that, all of a sudden you have a stable platform that, regardless of the caliber within reason, you're able to manage the recoil of that effectively. You're able to manage holding it, with its weight without that being a contributing factor, and you're able to be more accurate with it. And so he had this real altruistic motive around, I want to, get this into the hands of people with limited mobility, because they're excluded from a whole category of guns that they otherwise can't shoot. So it was really about, getting his friend back in the range, back shooting again. And what started off as a kind of just an idea to help one person quickly blossomed into something that has gone on to help a lot of people, but it's also just become a sort of, we've kind of created our own niche within the firearms market.
You sure did.
Which has been a great experience, all the way around. It's just been, there's been lots of ups and downs, of course, with that. But,
yes, we'll get to that.
Yeah, but overall, it's the American dream, right? I mean, that's what I love about what we did. Is it was two guys who had an idea and a little capital, and put them both together. Took some chances, a little bit of mitigated risk, but came out on top and continue to produce a product that a lot of people enjoy, and it's just been a very satisfying company to be a part of. As has the range, but SB in particular has been very satisfying.
Yeah, a very good friend of mine has nerve degeneration in one hand in particular is especially bad, but both hands are basically almost unusable. So you'd think, well, that person probably should never have a gun, but why not? I mean, as long as you can make it manageable for them, maybe attach it to their wrist or, make some other concession here and there aesthetically to give them this thing.
Right.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
Well, and that was exactly the kind of the thought process that we had originally behind this, is that everybody should be able to shoot, and regardless of any sort of physical limitation or debilitating factor, they should be able to shoot. So if that involves kind of thinking out of the box in terms of how we came up with the product to meet that need, then so be it. It worked out really well, and it turned out there's a larger community out there than what we had originally thought.
Much larger. Yeah. So let's talk about what an SBR is.
Sure.
And do your best to define it, how you think about it. And then also, if you can, try to explain what the ATF is trying to do to change the definition of SBR.
Yeah, so the United States is interesting in that, we're the only country, at least that I know of, that regulates firearms based on the length of the barrel. So, and this goes back to the late 20s, the 30s, and essentially what the U.S. decided, because you had a lot of people at that time who were getting firearms, putting them under trench coats, things like that. Guns were accessible at Sears. It was a different time frame. There really wasn't an ATF at that time. And there wasn't a lot of regulation around things like, you could buy a machine gun at Sears and Roebuck up until the late 20s, which to me is just crazy.
Different time.
At different times. You could also buy Bs. Apparently you could buy Bs from Sears and Roebuck and become an apiarist if that was something that you were looking to do.
And why not both?
Why not both? But the powers that be decided that we needed to regulate the length of the barrel. So any firearm that has a barrel or any barrel less than 16 inches that has a stock attached to it becomes what we call, or what the ATF calls, a short-barreled rifle. And those are legal to own as long as you're in a National Firearms Act, an NFA-friendly state, but you have to pay a $200 tax, fill out paperwork, process some ATF forms. It takes 9 to 10 months to get it through through that process. And just like a suppressor or other things that you can have, you're able to get what you're looking for, but it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to get to there, to that point.
So this is larger than a pistol, smaller than a rifle. It's right in that sweet spot where they think that is the thing that's dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's this misconception that the way a firearm looks mandates how it's going to be used, which has always been interesting to me, because it doesn't. Our product, for example, doesn't make a firearm any more lethal or any more prone to be used in any sort of disturbance or a crime of some sort. It's just it's just an accessory. That's all we are that goes on that firearm. But going back to your question, we have the U.S. has a law so that if you go into a gun range or a gun store and you want to buy a rifle, if that rifle has a stock on it, it has to have a barrel of 16 inches, which is interesting. And it kind of going back to the efficacy of a shorter barrel. Actually, the shorter the barrel you have on a firearm, you reduce the efficacy of that firearm, because you don't have that length of barrel. The shorter that barrel, you have less spin on the bullet, so it's not as stable. It's not going to have the same velocity. It's going to have a slower velocity. It's not going to be as accurate. So when you look at a gun with a shorter barrel, there's a trade-off. You have a compact size, which is great for maneuvering in tight quarters, but you lose accuracy at distance because you just don't have a long enough barrel.
So what is the ATF doing to change the laws right now? What did they do, and then what? Yeah,
ATF's been interesting. So if we go back in time 10 years when Alex and I started the company, one of the very first things that we did was that we contacted ATF because we wanted to make sure that we're producing a product that is not going to be construed to be illegal or is not compliant with laws and regs that the ATF has established. And so we wrote to them, and then we had a number of meetings with them, telephonically at first, but then in person as the years went on, where we sought their approval and sought clarification on our device and said, well, this is designed and intended for people to use who have limited mobility, limited use of their limited mobility. That's the best way for me to say it. And we want to make sure that this is not intended to be fired from the shoulder as a stock would be. It's a bifurcated flap, so it's a piece of rubber that opens up over your forearm. You're able to tighten it down. So the whole way that we developed it was for shooting from this position. This being an extension of the firearm, your forearm. Over the years, as our product got more and more penetration to the market, because of the fact that it wasn't regulated as a short barrel rifle, this doesn't make a firearm.
Well, first of all, what did they say when you had those meetings? What was their reaction?
First reaction was, we understand what you're trying to do. We don't think this is not a stock. That was one of the phrases that they came back. We don't think this is a stock, and as such, it's not beholden to all the rules and regs that ATF established relating to short-barreled rifles. So for us, that was a huge, we can go sell this thing, and ultimately, I can't control how an end user wants to use it. It's their, they want. Yeah,
this kind of reminds me of like an egg in a sock. An egg in a sock is just an egg in a sock. If you put an egg in a sock and you swing it over your head and throw it at somebody, is that a weapon? Well, I mean, I guess, sort of, you know what I mean? Like, it seems like anyone can misuse a product.
Right.
And if they're misusing your product in a way that you did not intend, then why would anyone who didn't break that rule be culpable? It seems more it's a user problem.
Right.
If you misuse a product in the same way, if you go kill somebody, that would be against the law.
Right.
So why wasn't it that simple?
And I think initially it was, but I think there's a point where we were becoming, this is probably year 3, year 4 of our company's existence, where we were starting to generate a lot of traction. And, ATF wanted to ensure that people understood what SBRs were. They understood that what pistols were. And again, that when you put our device on a AR-15 pistol, it doesn't reclassify, doesn't remanufacture the firearm into some different type of category of firearm. It's just an accessory. Mm-hmm. And so I think there was a period where initially they kind of went back and forth and said, well, maybe ultimate in use determines the classification of the product,
Sure.
which we said that's a difficult road to walk, because again, to your point about an egg and a sock, I don't know what somebody's actual end use of that product is going to be.
Right.
I know know why we designed it, how we designed it, and how it's intended to be used. And I think a lot of people
and you told them your intention. It
absolutely.
It wasn't like you left it up to guesswork here.
we were very matter of fact, because at that, again, if you go back to who we were 10 years ago, we were just 2 guys that had an idea, had a little capital, and before they went and risked all that capital and blood, sweat, and tears, wanted to make sure that the product that we produced as we envisioned it was going to be legal to sell, legal to own, legal to have.
And this isn't a firearm.
It's not a firearm. No, it's it's metal, aluminum, plastic, rubber, Velcro strap.
You don't think you could hurt me with this unless you took it out and hit me with it or something?
Even then, maybe if I dropped it off a 20-story building on top of your head, it might break the skin. But no, I don't think I could. It's not designed to hurt you. It's mostly rubber, as a matter of fact.
So when they got wind of how well you were doing, what suddenly changed? What did they try to do?
Well, they then, and this was interesting. We were in Vegas for the SHOT Show, which is the firearms industry's big industry show that they have once a year. Have at the Sands Expo. It's one of the biggest shows in Vegas. It's a lot of fun to go to. If you haven't been, you need to go.
No, no.
I know I took Chris. Chris had a great time.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
But at the beginning before SHOT Show started, there was an announcement from ATF that they planned to change their mind on our approval, and their stance at that time was, well, if you buy it and you put it on your gun, that's fine, and if you shoot it like it was designed to be, that's fine. But the minute you put it to your shoulder, you've manufactured or you've created a short-barreled rifle at that point. And
it just seems really, really silly to me.
Which was really silly.
But I get it. I mean, that seems like it at least makes sense. Everything up to this point makes sense.
Yeah, and the frustration we had was that there was a lack of clarity. There wasn't. We had follow-up questions. We wanted to understand more about how they had gotten to this conclusion, but also just for the firearms community, from other gun dealers, from individuals. We needed to be able to communicate to them as well, what we were being told, and the kind of the issue that I had at that time, and one of the things I didn't understand, which a lot of people didn't understand, was that you could have a gun with a brace on it, and at that time, if they were saying if you put it to your shoulder, you're remanufacturing, you're creating an SBR at that time. Well, if I was borrowing your gun and I decided to shoot it in a different fashion than you, does that mean that gun is now tied to the way in which I use that firearm?
Or what if someone does it accidentally, just assumes it does one thing?
Of course, yeah. And so there was a time period, there were a lot of dealers who were concerned, and the gun dealers, about selling it in stores because they were afraid of, like, I remember going to one where I put it up to my shoulder and the guy said, "Oh, don't do that." And I'm like, "Well, it's okay. I didn't, it's just a thing. I'm just holding it up right now. I'm not doing anything with this firearm." And so it had a chill factor, I think, on the sales of our product for a while. But conversely, as you can well imagine, in any sort of controversy often leads to generates publicity, and in the long run, that ended up being a good thing for us, as that it got a lot of people talking about firearms rules, firearms laws, whether or not this was inside the boundaries of what ATF is meant to be doing as a regulatory agency. They're supposed to regulate, interpret, not create. That's what our legislators do. They create laws, and ATF regulates those. And so what happened after a number of months of us going back and forth trying to get clarification on their position is that ATF ultimately rescinded their position and said, you know what, regardless of how someone uses the brace, that doesn't create a different class of firearm based on usage.
Well, that's sort of, now we're back to making more sense again.
Yeah, which to me was very logical, and said, yeah, that's what we had been doing for the past 3 years, sure. And that put us back on track to where we were previously, and allowed us to grow. And really, it's really a double-edged sword, right? Because at the time, it was very painful. I mean, there were a lot of sleepless nights because we're like, holy cow, we've put all this money and effort and energy into this
I remember
thing.
telling you a number of times, get out and while you can.
I know. Well, and there was a period of time.
Well,
it took a lot of, it just took a lot of determination to stay the course, stand our ground, and not get frustrated right out of the gate and blow up and get into an antagonistic relationship with ATF, because we didn't want to have an antagonistic relationship. We never have. We still don't. And I don't think we do, except when it comes to subsequent determination, which
came up fairly recently. This is maybe a year ago?
a little over a year ago. Like I would say November of 2020. Wait, 2019, is that right? 2021. Yes.
2021 R08, so it's got to be this last year.
I assume. Yes, so it was this last year, and again, we've tried to work closely with ATF, and because we want to understand what their process is for determining what constitutes a brace versus a stock. To that end, we probably have 30 different braces that we make today. And I think, I remember there was a phone call that Alex and I had at one point where we were putting every brace we were sending to ATF and saying, hey, can we do this? This is what we plan to do. We were doing one for the AK-47, for example. And I remember the contact at ATF that we worked with saying, you don't have to send in a request for we've already approved the category, so simply coming up with a different design that is related to a particular weapons system, it's the same principle. You don't have to write in every time and get approval for that, which was great. We still did a lot of that, though, and we actually included, for the first, I would say, 5 or 6 years of the company's existence, we included our original letter from ATF, kind of in a miniaturized version, with every brace that we sold, so that everybody could see exactly what ATF responded to us, how they responded to us about our product, and it not being a stock and not being subject to the National Firearms Act and the registration that goes on with short-barreled rifles. And that was, I think, good for the firearms community as well, because they got to see how that process worked and that we were being totally transparent with respect to what ATF was telling us.
Bring my microphone in there a little bit there. And so then all of a sudden they came out with this new piece of legislation that has all kinds of weird point system thing attached to it.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I printed this thing out just so people who are on camera can look at this thing. This is like 20-something pages of dense writing that is, I'm a pretty technical guy, and I've read exactly 1 million contracts. This is almost not legible.
It's very difficult to get through. I had to read it a number of times.
I read it last night, or I did my best anyway, and I walked away from it with a lot of thoughts.
Right. Well, and I think that's something that what you just touched on is pretty key, and kind of sums up my reaction overall to this latest push from ATF to try to classify and determine what makes a firearm an SBR versus a pistol. Is that it's so detail oriented, and it's a point system. There's everything from the type of weapon. There's a lot of of information that goes into determining whether or not that gun is a SBR or a pistol with a brace on it. And I think the average consumer doesn't want, they just want a product. They want to know that the product is legal to own, legal to use.
There were some pretty interesting things I thought in there. Like, for instance, one of them was if there's an optic on it that works, but only works when your hand is fully extended, then that counts as a pistol. But if it works when your eyes are close, then that's a rifle.
Well, and it
just like, how is it just seems bizarre that they would come to that conclusion.
That conclusion. And how do you then...
I mean, what if it's just out of focus?
Well, and then, how do you then determine... You're right. It's very confusing, very convoluted, and it sort of doesn't pass the common sense test. And there's been a lot of pushback, and it gave us a great sense of comfort seeing how the firearms community rallied behind us.
How did that go?
It went really, really well. I mean, ATF provided a defined period of time in which comments were allowed to be sent in through the federal government's register, and we had just an enormous outcry from the end user community and also the gun community at large, and had I think upwards of 150,000 written responses that went in. That stated, people's opinions on this proposed regulation, proposed reclassification, and it was very, the firearms industry is an interesting place to be. We tend to be a persecuted lot, in that we're providing something that is part and parcel to being an American. I mean, it's the Second Amendment. It's when this country was founded, it's what our founding fathers had in mind to not only put meat on the table, but also to prevent tyranny and to make sure that the common man has power and doesn't lose his voice and doesn't lose his ability to raise objection to the government.
I can safely say I don't think I've ever seen a document coming out of the government where a individual company's name is brought up at least half a dozen times throughout this thing.
Right.
That is, they're after you. I mean, they're not. This is not a.
Yeah, it's interesting because you
became a lightning rod. I mean, almost as much as the NRA itself.
Well, we did, and we. And the whole ecosystem now that exists 10 years down the road, or almost 10 years down the road, it's much larger than just us. We aren't the only manufacturers of braces out there. Lots of companies,
like SIG, for instance.
SIG is a great example. They make a brace, and they've been very successful with it. But we do seem to be the.
I mean, SIG, I think, is mentioned exactly once, and you're mentioned at least 6 times, maybe more.
Maybe more. So it's. These things kind of come out of left field. We literally had been moving business as normal for years, and then kind of got a heads up from our attorneys that something was coming down the pike, and it's been interesting to deal with. And I say interesting in that maybe frustrating is a better.
Is this a Biden specific thing?
No.
Or you think this was coming either way?
I think this was coming either way. I think the current administration facilitated it. I don't think, under a different administration, under Trump, the previous administration, this would have been pursued with much, the same level of intenseness. Is that a word? Intenseness?
Enthusiasm.
Sure. As it has been now. So we really seem to be something that's risen to the top of the ATF shortlist. And it's frustrating from the standpoint because we really don't understand why. Our products haven't been used in nefarious ways, haven't been used in any sort of tragic fashion. To your point about the egg in the sock, that's really a great analogy. It's just a brace. It's just a piece of stainless steel, rubber. That's we make here in America. We put people to work. We've created this ecosystem within the firearms community, which has generated a lot of growth And it's been exciting to be a part of that. And in many ways, it's been the American dream. It really has been, because you had two guys from very different backgrounds. You know, my business partner, Alex, had been in the armed services, Marines and the Army for close to 15 years. I had been working for SAP and Oracle on the software technology for years. And, you know, you had two guys who were really, really enthusiastic about farms. We just loved to shoot. He's from Jersey, I'm from Texas. Go figure. But, you know, we ended up in Florida and met each other at a gun range just because we have we really like the camaraderie that comes with shooting, the fellowship, and there's also a competitive side of the equation where
it's like golf kind of.
you want to best your friend, and it takes effort, right? Just like golf, you've got to have focus, you've got to work on your breathing, and there are lots of things you do. It's not just standing and shooting a gun in a general direction and being happy with that. You want to be accurate.
So how are things standing right now with the ATF? Are you feeling confident that you can with all this pushback? Because I mean, even if I wanted to follow this law, I think I would have to spend hours going over this just to figure out whether something I owned was or wasn't legal.
Well, and I think. And so
maybe hours, literally.
Well, and that's part of the crux of our response that we've had to ATF is that we've looked at it from the standpoint of our customers, most of which aren't into firearms as deep as I am. They're not following the ATF's website looking for updates on changes in firearms policies and procedures. They bought it at a time. It was legal to use at that time in that fashion, that way. And that's the last time they've ever thought about it. Maybe sitting in a closet somewhere. Maybe they don't use it, like I use firearms on a weekly basis. But creating that liability for law-abiding citizens by having something that they may not be aware of is changing categories or being reclassified, I guess is a better way to look at it.
Yeah, it's like owning a car and suddenly your car, like that car's outlawed. It's like, wait, what?
Right. And
I own it already. What am I going to do?
Well, and it's that whole due process part. There's no way that we can, we don't, because we sell direct, we sell through the channel, we sell through OEMs. I mean, we don't have a master customer list of every customer that owns our product.
No, gun owners don't like that.
They don't like that.
I'm surprised.
And there's no need for us to have that either. I mean, it's not possible for us to pull together that much information.
Sure.
And so it's been interesting to kind of watch how this developed.
So do you think it's going your way? Do you think it'll reverse this travesty?
I think because
or do you think they'll just refine it and make it more clear? Because this could easily be cleared up in hundreds of different ways. This is so poorly written.
I think as it currently stands, I think it's a non-starter. I think it's way too cumbersome on the average firearm owner to understand not only what they own and how it would be seen in the eyes of the ATF, as well as what they might buy. It's just too complicated of a process. You can't put the burden of a 27-page document to determine whether or not.
I think it's 26. By
26. Well, it was off a page.
I missed the cover page.
But when I take a step back and I just look at, okay, we're rational beings. We make rational decisions. To me, that seems an irrational approach to taking a look at something that's been around for almost a decade that hasn't caused any problems or commotion and creating issues where there are none. And I think there's a perception that something that looks small and compact and tactical, for lack of a better term, is more deadly. It's like just the common misconception that an AR-15 is more deadly than a deer rifle or a hunting rifle. They both have the same purpose in terms of their design and have the same capability.
Yeah, literally the same magazines and everything.
But just because one can hold 30 rounds versus 7 doesn't make...
a lot of those 7-rounders could just be replaced by 30.
Correct. So it
really is almost identical.
It really is. And so when I look at it from that standpoint and I remove the emotion, I feel better because I don't see a way that ATF can implement the classification as they currently have it defined. It's just too cumbersome. I don't see how they could pass that on.
Do you think they're done, or you think they're coming back?
Oh, I think they'll come back. If I had to put money on it, they've already sort of kicked the can down the road a little bit and have said that they won't be coming back with a response until August. So it's kind of we're going to punt and we're going to tell you in August what we think. I think they're going to come back in August and say we need to punt again, or we're going to refine our approach because what we have put together as it stands today in that document that you're holding is far too cumbersome and far too difficult for the average firearms owner to be responsible for going through.
So the reason I wanted you to come is because the Second Amendment is definitely one of the most controversial topics in American culture,
right,
for all kinds of reasons. I think before we delve into those specific reasons, it's probably good to start talking about what the Second Amendment actually is, because I think there is a pretty big misconception of it for, I would say, more than half the people I hang out with don't want to shoot, don't like guns, don't like talking about guns, don't like looking at guns. They're just totally turned off by the whole idea. They're literally allergic to everything about it. But usually when I talk to them even a little bit, I can see very large misperceptions on what it even is. What are we even talking? We're not even using the same language.
Right.
And they make some very weird assumptions about things that I'm just not sure where they're even getting this information, because it's not based in reality from what I can tell. So briefly, what I think the Second Amendment was, it started off as a way, because keep in mind, we had just fought a pretty massive war, and we had a loose colony of states, and everyone's pretty beat up.
Yep.
This is not a group of people who, it's kind of a lot like Ukraine right now. This is a kind of a war-torn group of people, and a lot of limbs lost, a lot of lives lost, a lot of family members who are crying.
Right.
It was not a happy time. But I think there was some celebration and some, oh my gosh, I think we've just done it. I think we've made a country. But the problem is, you made a country with a bunch of different countries in it. There was 13 countries, and they all were sort of their own thing, kind of banded together just to fight off the common enemy. But I think everyone wanted to have that sort of like, we're our own thing. Call us a state, call us a country, whatever. But we want to be our own thing. Like, don't come across the border. Don't tell us what to do.
Right.
And the only thing that we agree on is you can have taxes, but that is only for security. That's only for the security of the state, the common states, the United States. And so they created the Second Amendment, but along after ratifying the original Constitution, they created the First and Second Amendment. First Amendment being number one for obvious reasons. They want everyone to be able to say whatever they want. Second is to protect the first one.
Right.
And the way I understand it is there's two separate things going on there. Number one, they needed everyone to agree that we're not going to come for your guns.
Right.
Because we need you to have them, because we have this invading force that could come back any time, and we just kind of barely hung on there. But also, we don't want you to feel like we're coming in. We're not going to come in and take your guns and take over your land or whatever. The federal government is not going to become the next king. First of all, any reactions to that? Does that seem like that makes sense?
No, that makes sense to me. And I think if we go back in time and you think about, to your point about people were, they'd gotten through it. We had, beaten off the English and, stood our ground. At that point in time, everybody had a firearm who was in the United States because you needed one. You needed one to put food on your table, needed one to keep your family safe. To what you said earlier, we were 13 different countries. We weren't an organized lot with a federal system. We didn't have, unified police forces or federal agencies.
Pretty rustic.
It was pretty rustic. And I don't think we would have been successful in rising up and fighting against the British if we wouldn't have been an armed country. If people didn't have those firearms already, we wouldn't have had the same outcome. You saw in the Ukraine, the president saying, "Oh, if you need a gun, come down and get one. We're giving them out." Like that's too little, too late at that point. People. I think to what you said, there was a recognition that they couldn't have done what they did without having the firearm, without the individual having the firearm, and to try to regulate that post-war and say, all right, well, we appreciate all that you did, but we're going to go ahead and need you to turn in your firearms now. Like that would not have sold. That was part of the reason that we were ultimately successful, is that we had armed citizens who were able to stand up and say, this is tyrannical. We can do better. We can govern ourselves, and we ought to be able to govern ourselves.
So the way it reads is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. One of the words that often gets misunderstood a lot is regulated, because regulated, unfortunately, has lots and lots of definitions, like an enormous amount. And to regulate has even more. It's like probably 30 different definitions. But the way it was meant at the time was similar to how you say, like, I'm going to regulate my digestive tract. It's not like I'm going to, have a cop come over and like monitor me or something. What it means is make sure it's functioning. Right. It's a well-regulated in the sense where you are regulated, your body you're regulating your temperature. It means orderly, right? In this context. So if you read it, a orderly militia, and militia also has a bit of a weird meaning. Militia, as it was defined and is still defined, actually, is any male, which is kind of, the ladies out there should be annoyed about that one, but any male between the ages of 17 and 45, under 45, unless you are in the National Guard or I think it's the Naval Reserves or something, Naval Militia, I believe, then you can go up to under 64, I think, is what the cutoff is. Or if you're a woman and you happen to be in the reserves, that's the militia. That's everybody in there. So I am not a member of the militia. I don't think you are either, based on what I know about you. But effectively, the bulk of what you'd call like the fighting force of the United States is part of the militia, whether they understand that or not. Right. That's kind of a weird side effect of the way these laws are written. It's not to say that you have to have a gun or you have to train or you have to know anything about what's going on, but this is sort of the foundation of things like the draft. It's like, well, you're already part of the militia. We're calling up the militia. We're bringing them forward, which I know a lot of people have problems with, but these are all sort of the same set of laws, kind of doing the same set of things. Is that how you feel?
I think that's a fair assessment. And yes, times have changed from the 1700s to where we are now, but I'm 100% confident that if you would have asked any of our founding fathers, today, if their stance, the principles behind why we have the amendments that we've made to the Constitution are sound, and those are in my perspective, those are kind of the guiding bars that keep us in line. We have to have those. We have those in place so that they can't be taken away. Mm-hmm. Those are our rights. That's the.
Now, I also like to go back in time and think about what would they do and what would they say if you started giving them edge cases here, because when they say shall not be infringed, a lot of people will assume what that means is there can't be anything the government would ever do to stop anyone ever. Well, what about people in jail?
Right.
What about the crazy guy down at the edge of the bar where everyone knows that guy should not have a gun because he's just going to go crazy? Like they clearly had sanitariums. Right. They clearly knew that there are certain people who are just not trustworthy with guns.
Or take it for example, children, right? You're not going to sell a firearm to a...
Well, that's the militia. So that all is covered in there. But what about something like there's just somebody who's very, very mentally incapable, mm-hmm. Not necessarily crazy, just, this person is, Down syndrome or whatever. Like, you just don't necessarily trust this person with a gun. Are we saying that the founding fathers wouldn't have just understood that there was some sort of, okay, well, obviously we're not talking about them. We're talking about able-bodied.
Yes.
And able-bodied means something to them, but it wasn't real codified in law.
Right. Well, and I think to answer, I think it was meant to be able-bodied. Obviously you can go down to the minutia and mm-hmm. always find ways or examples in which, well, does it apply to this? Does this make sense? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it does. But in general, I think able-bodied is how it was approached.
And unfortunately, that was probably very common sense at the time, and now it is turned into something completely different. I have the same feeling about the First Amendment, by the way. So obviously we have this, everyone should be able to say anything they want, except, yelling fire in the theater, which is great. Eric Weinstein actually did something really funny. He had everybody sing along a song. He's like, actually, I don't remember the words super well, so if you wouldn't mind just sing along. So he's like, come on, baby, light my... And then he stopped, and everyone was singing along, and they all yelled fire in the theater. I would have loved to have been there to see that actually. But that is a great example of where context really matters, because the DA is not going to go arrest them. You know,
Context and intent, right? I mean, the intention was not to cause panic. I mean, it was, I understand what Eric was doing there, but it's just a word. It's just a word. So it's the intent, it's the context in which that word is used. You know, does it create panic at the disco? Does it create, no, that wasn't the intent.
Right. And yet that law is actually kind of poorly written in that regard, because what one person's panic might be the other person's just satire.
Right.
And so that is, I have a similar sort of problems where there's these weird edge cases that unfortunately the founding fathers just didn't know how weird the internet was going to get.
They hadn't figured out how weird that old internet was going to be back in 1776. Well, and I think that even today, look, let's say we were starting a new country and we came up with our own constitution, and a couple of years into it, we needed to make amendments along the way. We can't predict what life's going to be like in 200 years. I mean, take the internet, for example. I mean, when I was a kid, we didn't have the internet. So trying to describe that to me 30 years ago, I don't know if I would have grasped that as well as I do now. Yeah, now I get it. I totally understand the pervasiveness of the internet and the role that it plays in disseminating information, good and bad. But that sort of conceptually wouldn't have been something that, our founding fathers
I know
would
for a
have
fact if I saw myself come back from the future, I would definitely know that person knows more than I do. Don't mess with them. I just get more and more scarier as the years go by. So let's talk about the NFA Act, 1934. My understanding was this was mostly a set of laws that were meant to stop the mafia.
Correct.
Is that your understanding?
And so if we go back to what I said kind of early on in this conversation around the ability to purchase firearms without having a dealer involved. There wasn't the concept of a dealer. You could go to your hardware store, whether it's Sears or your local hardware store, down the street, and buy a firearm because they were seen as tools in the same way that a hammer is seen as a tool. A firearm at that time was seen as a tool to put meat on the table, to provide safety in your house, provide a shooting sport with your kids, whatever it might be.
And that used to be a thing back then. I mean, now it's kind of inconceivable, but people used to go to the gym and shoot their 22s, and that was a thing.
Times change.
Carrying a gun to school was required. I mean, you had to do it, otherwise you weren't going to pass class.
Well, and if you think about it, back in that time frame, again, as a country, we were growing, we were developing. We didn't have 911, and even when you have 911, it's not an instant salvation that occurs. It takes time for our men in blue to get to the citizens who are in need.
It sure does.
So you've got that time period that exists from when you place the call to when actually people show up. So you've the ability to protect yourself, protect your family. I think a lot of people have seized upon that and said, that's why I need to have a firearm. It's not because I, need to rise up and fight. It's because I want to have the ability to protect my family in the event something unplanned happens.
So I think also when the NFA went in place, I think there was a lot of very gruesome murders happening where people were going in and shooting up, basically entire neighborhoods, and that was sort of their way of sending a message.
Right.
But there's really nothing stopping anyone from making a modification to a weapon and doing the exact same thing today. So what has and clearly these people don't care about the law, otherwise they wouldn't be in their business. So what does the NFA Act actually do today? What are we talking? What is this doing for the public today, do you think?
Well, and I think there's probably two acts that are worth talking about. There's the National Firearms Act of 34, I believe, and there's also the Gun Control Act of 68, which combined really provide the regulatory arm or regulatory piece of what the ATF implements. And I kind of going back to the 30s, you had the proliferation of the Tommy gun, for example, which could be, you could purchase at $20 from a hardware store with no background check, no age requirement, no requirements in general. And I think at that time, when people were seeing how these firearms are being used in the way that they were being used by the mafia, by the mob, logically, it made sense that, you shouldn't be able to go down to Sears and just buy a machine gun off the rack. You probably want to regulate that. Maybe that needs to belong in its own category. And I think most countries, and the U.S. is unique in that in the U.S., if you're in a National Firearms Act friendly state, you can legally own a machine gun or a suppressor or a short-barreled shotgun or short-barreled rifle. A lot of countries, you can't even own a handgun. I mean, take the UK. Just owning a rifle or a shotgun requires a fair amount of permitting, processing. It's no easy feat. So the fact that in the U.S. we created this way of defining what falls into what bucket made sense, and I think does make sense. And I think if you look at, and there are millions of firearms that are in the National Firearms Act registry. And again, these are all things like machine guns and grenade launchers and some of these things that sound pretty extreme. But the reality is none of those firearms or weapons have been used in a nefarious way. There's a lot of background checks that go on with respect to making sure that they're going into people who don't have criminal backgrounds, who haven't, been judged to have been mentally defective or, had crimes of domestic violence that they've committed. Again, logically, I think we all agree that we don't want to put guns in the hands of people that have made bad choices, or buying it to make more bad choices. Mm-hmm. So that made sense, and I think we needed regulation to create healthy boundaries for what can go where, what can be purchased by whom, and what might require additional levels of approval in order to own that.
I think Ukraine is an interesting use case where they have a general population that is, just normal human beings who are making Molotov cocktails
right.
and getting in sniper positions and making it very, very difficult for people to move around inside the country unless
right.
they're on their side. And I think the people in the United States just can't imagine that kind of situation would ever happen in the United States. And yet we have had a civil war here.
Yeah.
We have had multiple wars, the Spanish-American War. We've had, the Canadians have come down and burnt down the White House once. It hasn't been a while. It's been, many, many years since we've had conflict of any real meaningful size other than maybe Pearl Harbor. But we're not necessarily impervious to foreign invaders. So one of the interesting things about this is how many of the weapons you see on the ground, and there's a couple of very interesting Twitter feeds about this, they're just small arms. They're just people with rifles or, people with sniper rifles, but still just rifles, nothing that would even be covered by the NFA Act.
Right. And I think the vast majority, if you look at firearms that are used in crimes, they're regular firearms. They're not, a silenced, integrally suppressed silenced machine gun or submachine gun. It's just a rifle that's being used in a way that is criminal. I mean, just in the same way a car could be used as a ramming.
Mm-hmm. And has.
And it has. Mm-hmm. We don't ban the car because the car can be used in a dangerous way. It doesn't make sense. I mean, common sense says car brings a lot of good to this world, allows us to be mobile, allows us to, all sorts of freedoms that we wouldn't have if we were dependent on public transportation or our own 2 feet.
Just wait till we have self-driving cars and they get hacked.
Yeah.
I don't think people are understanding how bad that could possibly be, but it could get pretty bad.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the different gun controversies out there. We talked a little bit about automatic weapons, but we talked about them in the wholesale, like this gun is shipped as fully automatic. But there's also things like bump stocks, and there's binary triggers. And then there's just people who are really, really fast and semi-automatic and can get very close to fully automatic speeds just by having a very well set up trigger. In fact, I used to play quite a bit of paintball once upon a time, and there's something called a double trigger where you just as fast as you can tap the button, like, and it's all just little electronics inside that governs whether it shoots or not. And people would be hard pressed to know that is not fully automatic.
Right.
Like very fast.
Right.
Like
well,
15 balls a second, and that's with my fingers. Just doing that.
Right.
So.
Well, I think that's a good point because you can take an AR-15. I mean, take a shotgun, for example. There are not really any, and there are a couple people who have tried automatic shotguns over the years, but there really isn't a fully automatic shotgun out there that's been mass produced and used in large quantities, because it doesn't really need to. You can just pull the trigger, pump it, whether it's a pump action or not. You don't need to unload it at 1,500 rounds per minute. It's okay the way it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, there's a misconception that just because something is fully automatic, it's more dangerous. And if you look at our own armed forces back in the mid '80s, when the U.S. Army put out its request to replace the M16A1 with a follow-on firearm, which became the M16A2, they moved from fully automatic guns to 3-round burst, because the Army had been doing studies and showing that there was a lot of ammunition that was getting wasted on fully automatic fire, because, as you know, when you pull the trigger, you've got a controlled explosion that's happening, and the power of physics take over. And
yeah, actually, this is a point that maybe not everybody listening will understand. So semi-automatic and fully automatic,
sure.
Could you define that just so the word?
Yeah. So the way I would define that, semi-automatic is when you pull the trigger, one bullet is fired with each pull of that trigger, and that's not including binary devices or bump stocks or anything like that, mm-hmm. but it's one trigger pull, one shot. When you move to what's called automatic, fully automatic, it's a pull of the trigger, and depending on the design of the gun, whether it engages or disengages the sear, however that's designed, it will fire multiple bullets as long as you're holding that trigger. And whether it's 2 bullets, 3 bullets, or as many as you can have in a magazine, the way the government looks at that is, if it can fire more than one, it becomes a fully automatic and then becomes subject to the National Firearms Act of 34.
And then bump stocks. So bump stocks effectively just use the recoil to basically make your finger move without moving, kind of thing.
Basically, and I don't have a bump stock. To me, that's not.
Well, they're not legal anymore.
Well,
of course not.
That's true. But even when they were legal, it wasn't something that I was really interested in. And to me, that the bump stock was a way to try to replicate the full auto fire, but in a less than precise fashion, because the bump stocks don't, from what I've seen, they don't operate the same every single time you pull the trigger. Sometimes they fire as designed, or they fired as designed. Sometimes they didn't. But regardless of that,
a lot can go wrong. It's pretty clunky.
It's pretty clunky. It's pretty clunky. But I think there's this belief within the firearms community that as long as you are a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen of the United States, mm-hmm. and you don't have a criminal record, and you haven't been a bad person, bad husband, you haven't done acts that are considered criminal, you should be allowed to have whatever it is that you want, as long as you don't break any laws, don't do anything that would otherwise result in a catastrophic situation. I mean, I'm a huge firearms nut. I mean, I love firearms. I don't ever want to have to use a firearm on a person. I mean, that would be that's not something that I ever want to do, but something that I have to consider, that if it came to that and I was at home and I've got a 7-year-old daughter and my house was being invaded, I'm not going to risk. We'll get to that.
We'll come back to this one. I certainly want to talk more about it, but let's stay with the technology stuff for a minute. Suppressors. So this is one of those that it just seems like Hollywood is to blame for this one.
Right.
Like, suppressors are not something that are used in crimes, like, ever.
Right.
And they're not particularly difficult to manufacture in your home. I mean, like, it's extremely easy. So if bad guys wanted to use them for some reason, they absolutely could. But no bad guys ever that I'm even aware of ever, literally, maybe other than some spooks somewhere, have ever used a suppressor in a crime. So what's the deal? Why is this something we're worried about?
And I think a lot of it is what you just said earlier on, which was the way in which maybe Hollywood portrays suppressors. I mean, I love James Bond. I mean, he uses a suppressor more than just about anyone. But even then, the practicality of having a suppressor and spreading it on the barrel, like it's not something that becomes...
It's bigger and clunkier and heavier and slows the round down, and it's kind of a lot of bad things.
And oddly enough, doesn't sound at all like the sound that you hear in the movies.
Nothing like it.
Nothing like it at all.
Yeah.
It's more of a...
But on the flip side, if you're a conservationist or care about the outdoors, suppressors are great.
Totally great. And I'll go back to my 7-year-old daughter. I can be around her if we're outside, and I can have a firearm that has a suppressor on it, and I can shoot it without it exceeding OSHA hearing level concerns, without me having to put ear protection on her if I don't want to have that. Mm-hmm. Now, naturally, I always have ear protection on her.
Just in case.
But in case, it's not jarring.
And the birds don't care. The livestock don't care. Your dog doesn't care.
Right. And it's not something that, again, if you looked at, intention, suppressor, it traps the gases as they expand. There's a lot of things that kind of go on with those concentric series of baffles inside of a suppressor. But it doesn't make it more accurate. It actually has the opposite effect on it.
Slows it down.
Slows it down.
Yeah, it seems to me it's almost backwards. It seems like the government, if they actually cared about any of this, they'd say everyone should have a suppressor because they're
hearing safe. I mean, it's
safe.
Well, and if you think about, you mentioned earlier the gun range that I own, that sound was something that we had to put a lot of consideration into, because it can be jarring for people watching who aren't in the range or are standing back and just observing. As well as other people in the range. So you want to manage that sound as best you can. And not everybody has suppressors, because a lot of people don't want to go through the red tape of filling out the paperwork, submitting it and waiting that time, and that's okay. But there are lots of us who do. And a suppressor is not a prohibitively expensive thing to get. $600 to $1,000 you can have.
I can introduce you some good audio engineers if you want to get that down even further. But 3D printed guns. This is another kind of bizarre one where there seems to be a lot of moral panic about them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a million ways to make a gun.
Yeah.
Like really. It always strikes me as funny when there's a gun buyback programs. Everyone thinks, oh, we're going to get all these guns off the street. But all that happens is people submit pieces of pipe with like a nail hanging off the end. Like, well, this would shoot. It would shoot a shotgun shell. That's a gun, and they're like, so they have to pay this guy $200 for his like $5 worth of parts or whatever.
Right.
And occasionally some grandma brings in her, old hunting rifle or whatever that she doesn't know how to shoot anyway. And that's pretty much the end of it. But 3D printed guns seems kind of ridiculous. Like, why is the government's after this in particular? Like, I don't have anything particularly great to say about Cody Williams, the guy who kind of pioneered a lot of this. I think he got in some pretty bad controversies related to underage ladies. But the idea that you can try to regulate bits and bytes on a computer that could be downloaded from by anyone anywhere and just extruded on some printer somewhere seems just bizarre. Like, what are we talking about?
Well, and I think, again, there's a practical side of it. It just doesn't, to your earlier point, there are a number of different ways to get a firearm, and printing it on a 3D printer is definitely not the easiest way.
Well, not only is it's the fastest way just to have the worst day of your life.
Right.
But then secondly, it's not going to work very well. You might get 1 or 2 shots off.
Well, and that's a great point. I mean, it's one thing if I'm printing stuff on a 3D printer for a diorama that I'm making with my daughter, but
sure.
It's different if it's something that is going to be controlling or managing a controlled explosion,
sure.
Like firing a bullet. I wouldn't want to shoot a gun from a 3D printer. I mean, that's not something I would feel comfortable with.
No, and it just seems to me like it's a moral panic. It's a lot of people worried that suddenly there's going to be guns everywhere. When's the last time you've seen some guy in the street walking around with a 3D printer?
Right.
It just doesn't happen.
Right.
Like it's like it's these manufactured concerns. I mean, there are real concerns with guns. That just can't be one of them. It's not even the top 100 things.
No,
we're talking about.
I'm not. You think about the guy who's going to Comic-Con and wants to dress as Master Sergeant from Halo and wants a cool futuristic firearm that looks like the Halo gun. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's fine for a 3D printer. It's not a firing firearm, but to take something that's been manufactured and try to turn that into a device that could be used regularly, no, and it thwarts the sort of agreed upon notion that we do want regulation when it comes to creating manufactured firearms. Mm-hmm. people have the right to create a firearm, but if you do that, then you have to register it with ATF. To me, that makes sense.
Yeah.
We don't, we do background checks for a reason. We want to, like you would with any product that could be used in a potentially dangerous way, you want to have a way of tracking that and understanding how many are being made, how many are being sold. That makes total sense to me. So trying to thwart that by making it at home would seem illogical. And I think part of the issue is this. It's not a glamorization. That's not the right word I'm looking for. But it's this notion from people who maybe don't fully understand what a 3D printer is, or don't understand what a firearm necessarily is, or the people behind who would what the buying patterns are of people who buy firearms. And we don't want something that a guy made on a printer at his house. We want something that.
I think the only excuse they could make for getting involved in this is because they're just dangerous to the person shooting.
Right.
You're much more likely to burn yourself or to trying to get this hot stuff together, or the gun will explode in your hand than you are going to hurt anybody else. Much more likely.
Yeah. And I think, that's a fair concern. But, I think when this whole hullabaloo started several years ago about 3D printed guns, there was a lot of coverage in the media about this. Mm-hmm. And, it hasn't really amounted to anything.
Yeah, we've had multiple years now where 3D printed guns are downloadable right now. Right. You can go get them if you feel like it. I don't see them. They're not being used. So what was going on there? This is the kind of thing that this drives me crazy, because there's so much talk about in the press, and no one's thinking like, no one's going to spend $1,000 to make something that you could make much cheaper, like $200 and safer,
right,
with other parts,
right,
that are freely available.
Right.
You could just go to the hardware store and do it.
Right. It's insane. It is insane. You're absolutely
people
right.
are just not thinking this problem through.
They don't think it through, and I think that's because it's just glossed over at a high level. I mean, if you think about in the early 80s, kind of when the Glock pistol was becoming
plastic guns,
it was plastic guns, right? There was all sorts of media noise around.
They're going to be able to bring these things right through security.
You're a Fort Airport security with this plastic gun. Well, it has polymer parts, but it still has a steel barrel. I mean, it still has lots of metal in it. So that was just a great example of, conceptually, this could be,
for years later, I thought they were talking about something other than the Glock, because I'm like, well, it can't be that gun.
Right.
So what are they talking?
It's got a metal slide. I mean, there's lots of metal on that gun, but you can see how it becomes interesting conversation if you skew it to, it's something that could, you could get past a metal detector, and it's not. I mean, it never was designed or intended to be used in that fashion.
So, for the audience's sake, I think I need to describe where I stand on this whole thing.
Sure.
And so this is a bit of a story, but I think it'll be useful for anyone listening. So I see myself as a protector, not a collector.
Mm-hmm.
I don't own like this massive arsenal of cool looking guns. I have a few, but I have always seen myself as somebody who runs towards danger. And if I'm going to do that, I gotta know what I'm doing, basically. And also, by virtue of the fact that I've been involved in a lot of investigations, and I've brought in a lot of people who are quite prominent, as a matter of fact, to justice, I have had a number of death threats, really fairly credible death threats, and so I just have guns. One day I might have to use it, and that's always how I thought of them. They're sort of around, but not something I really focused very much on up until, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago or so. And then one evening, I should say, someone tried to get into the house. And my wife at the time woke me up and said, "Hey, Robert, there's somebody trying to get in the house." And my reaction wasn't to flee, and my reaction wasn't to freeze. It was to fight.
Right.
The very first thing, like up, ready to go. Grabbed, I had a shotgun under the bed, and grabbed it, and I went to the door, completely buck naked for the ones who want to visualize that.
I mean, you naked with a shotgun. There's some shock factor there in that imagery. But at the time, your wife called the police, I assume?
Not yet. Okay. I was having a discussione with the person on the other side of the door, and we're yelling at each other. He's calling me all these names, let me in, and trying to get in. And I'm like, and
this is out of left field. Like you don't know this person. This guy is, in your backyard.
In the backyard, coming in through the bedroom door.
Wow.
And so I'm going to cut forward in the story a little bit just because there's a lot going on there. Police were called, but I still had to deal with this person. Turns out that shotgun is terrible for home defense for all kinds of reasons I'm not going to get into. But so I ended up grabbing a pistol that I had, sort of a backup weapon. And I went outside, which I would not recommend. Do not ever chase an adversary, but I was not as well trained as I am now. And I went outside and tried to find this guy. And he was hiding in a bush. I told him he had a couple seconds to leave, or I was going to come out and start shooting. And he didn't leave. And it turns out there's some good reasons for that. I had a chain link fence on one side and a privacy fence on the other. He climbed the chain link fence just fine, but he couldn't get out of the privacy fence. So I basically caught him.
Right.
You know what I mean? There was no way for him to escape. And so he was trying at that point to climb over my fence into my neighbor's yard, and he has 2 little girls there. So I'm thinking about somebody, just imagine your daughter there.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, there is no way that's happening.
Right.
Like you're just staying right where you are. So I used my rather aggressive outdoor Robert voice. You can just imagine every curse word I could think of. And I got him out of the bush. It was this big, 10 foot by 10 foot by 6 foot bush, right? And I got him, and he was unwilling to get on the ground. He didn't want to get all the way in the ground. He was okay being on all fours, but he didn't want to go all the way down. And I couldn't quite figure out why at first. Later on, I figured out because he had this very nice white shirt on, which I had not been able to see up to this point. Like, it was very dark. And so I ended up basically holding this guy at gunpoint for about 14 minutes or so.
Wow.
While the cops came. They thought he was up and down the street. He didn't realize he's in the backyard. But at one point in this moment, it's not like this all happened very quickly. This is so long. I mean, 14 minutes is...
That's an eternity.
I mean, just sit there and do nothing for 14 minutes. And you'll know how long that was. On top of the fact that this adrenaline's going, and there's this person who's very erratic and yelling at me still. Like, this is not
complying with your
He's doing everything
demands,
wrong.
right?
Everything wrong. He seems extremely aggressive and angry. Like, this is not someone like, oh, I'm mea culpa. Like,
Right.
And so at one point he starts reaching into his back pocket as if to grab something. And I didn't know if he had a knife in there. I didn't know if he had a gun. And I yelled at him to get his hand out of his pocket. He claimed it was a cell phone and his friends were calling me, which is entirely plausible. But in that moment, I had made the decision that I was going to kill him.
Wow.
I mean, I didn't have to because he didn't do anything.
Right.
But I overcame that part. Like, I think everyone's like, would I be able to do it?
Right.
I had already made the decision.
Yeah, you'd already assessed the risk, and regardless of the adrenaline in your system, I mean, it's a legitimate situation that you're in.
I've never known whether I could or not until that second when I realized if there's somebody who's going to hurt me or my loved ones, there's absolutely no way I'm going to let that happen.
Right. And
absolutely, I know at this point that I'm capable of doing it. So that was the first thing sort of that I realized out of it. So the cops came, they were not impressed by his unwillingness to get on the ground, so they smeared him through my yard.
I probably am.
There was a big boy on top of him. So they dragged him off. I figured out who the guy was later, and then, I used my special set of skills to know everything about the guy that there is to ever to know, as you would imagine. But I also learned that I was incredibly poorly trained.
Right.
I had no idea what I was doing. So I went to the range, your range, the range in Austin, and I met a Navy SEAL who worked there, Jeff Gonzalez, and I started taking classes. I met you shortly thereafter.
I remember.
Yep. And that was the point at which I realized how far I had to go before I was even competent with a gun.
Right.
I was not even close. And I'd shot all my life, at ranches or at friends, parties or whatever, when they go to a gun range. It is not what people make it look at all on TV. It is just very, very different. It is almost Zen. You have to really know what you're doing, and you have to practice all the time and practice in the right ways. Just going in, spraying and praying is not going to make you good. In fact, I know for a fact that if I had pulled the trigger, I don't even think I would have hit that guy.
Right.
I would have tried to hit him, obviously, but I don't know that I was any threat to him at all. Turns out he was a CPA and just drunk and trying to go to an Airbnb, and he thought I was just one of his asshole friends trying to mess with him. So I am very glad I didn't do that. And this, in the moral philosophy terms, would be a lack of proportionality. I didn't have the right to kill him,
right?
But I didn't know that.
Right.
I had no idea, and he did literally everything wrong. So,
well, and I think that's to your point about getting training, not just understanding how to use the firearm, but understanding what to do if a scenario like that presents itself.
I mean, and how weird,
And
right?
yeah, and how
It came out of nowhere.
I mean, and that's how those situations come up. And I think it's hard to appreciate the amount of adrenaline and what that does to you as well when that's coursing through your veins in a life-threatening situation. Because again, you at the time, it's a guy in your backyard. That's all you know. You're butt naked. You're trying to go to bed, and you've got this intruder. And to me, if I was in that situation, I would have done the same thing. I think I would have for sure grabbed my gun, called 911, and kept that guy, in place until the police arrived.
The police did say that I had the right to kill him, and they were very glad I didn't.
I'm glad you didn't either.
He was just a CPA, just drunk, high, and just in my yard.
Right.
Thought he was thought he was at his Airbnb down the street.
Right.
That's very dangerous. I mean, so I have several thoughts about that. Number one, I mean, how do we make sure that we are getting people trained?
Right.
Like that is the thing that I realized out of everything. And that had the biggest ripple effect of my life, is actually getting good with firearms.
Right.
Because I realized that there is no way I was going to let that happen twice.
Right.
One of the things that Jeff asked is, in your last encounter, were you good, or was the other person just very unlucky?
Right.
And I think he was just much, much worse than I was. He was just that bad off, because I did everything wrong too.
But by not putting yourself in that position ahead of time and thinking about, all right, what happens now that I own this firearm? What happens if I have a home invasion? Most people don't. When you look at since COVID, 40% of firearm sales have gone to new firearms owners.
Yeah, I've read this.
Which is an incredible stat.
When that COVID thing was happening, you were just out of guns.
We were. I mean,
there was nothing left. You were cleaned out.
The shelves were bare. Hopefully we'll never see anything like that again in our lifetime. But completely caught just about everybody. By surprise in terms of how quickly that supply that existed just evaporated. From firearms to ammunition, it just disappeared. And rightfully so. I mean, during that time frame, there was a lot of civil unrest, a lot of people, defunding of police forces, and ultimately, kind of to what I said earlier on, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and she's the most precious thing in the world to me. And there's no risk worth taking with her that I would willingly put myself in. I want to be the master of my own destiny in that regard. And even when if you have detained somebody who is breaking into your property, most people forget about the fact that when you call the police, there's lag time between when
enormous lag time.
Enormous. And to your point, I just learned something new about the story today when you told it, that they weren't at your house. They responded and they were down the street.
Yeah, they thought the person was running down the street, because that was our assumption, is he'd actually left.
Fled, right.
Yeah, but he didn't.
Right.
He went into a bush.
Right. And so it shows you when that's all happening in real time, there's a lot of communication that should be happening that maybe is not being, relayed properly with the dispatcher.
Another detail of that story, actually, it was actually my next door neighbor who called the police. He's like, "Robert's got him on the ground." And he's like, "Oh, they thought he was down the street." And he's like, "No, he's in the backyard right now. He's yelling at him." And so that's how this all, because I could have been out there for half an hour.
Right.
I mean, who knows? Who knows how long that would have taken?
And what happened when the police showed up? Did you say, "Hello, I'm the homeowner. I've got the gun. Don't shoot me"?
My wife at the time told them, my husband is the one with the gun.
Naked guy with the gun.
At this point, I had put something on, but yes. And she made them stop and say, "Repeat it back to me, which one my husband is." And like, he's the one with the gun. She was very smart. So, and then they came out and they detained me and the other person, which it was actually very concerning, because it took them a while to get this guy wrestled to the ground. Meanwhile, they're like trying to get the gun away from me. I'm like, but he's still kind of feisty. You know what I mean? Like, it ended up being okay, except for they didn't understand the operation of my pistol.
Right.
They weren't trained. So details about the type of gun and how it works and all the sort of the nuances around
chamber around or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
It might be.
I mean, these little things you kind of don't think about. The fact it has a safety, the fact that there's a decock lever on there. Like these are things they're not used to.
Right.
They have Glocks in.
Well,
that is all they train on.
And all firearms are not created the same. And for a lot of people who don't shoot regularly or don't maybe own a firearm or one pistol. Pistols can be without a safety. They can be with a safety. There are all sorts of different ways in which they operate. So no two pistols are necessarily the same. And, a Glock is very different. There is no safety. It's a striker fired pistol. Once a round is in the chamber, it's ready to shoot. Other pistols, like a 1911 style pistol, you've got duplicate safeties. You've got one in the grip. You've got one on either side that you can pull down you need to pull down to fire the weapon. And throw in a bunch of adrenaline and a crazy guy in your backyard, and then you've got opportunities for failure, break points.
For instance, I had the safety off, but I wasn't sure I had the safety off.
Right.
And the last thing I want to be doing is messing with a gun with somebody who's potentially a very dangerous threat in my backyard, who is still yelling at me this whole time, by the way. This is not a passive individual. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how much I didn't know in that moment. And part of the process of immediately afterwards, after the cops left and everything was kind of cleaned up, I actually stayed up for several hours just writing down all the mistakes that had been made.
Wow.
No lights in the backyard. I couldn't see what was going on. I shouldn't have gone outside, et cetera, et cetera. And, a bunch of things like that, the gun issues and so on. And I'm really, really glad I did that, because I think I avoided PTSD. Had I not done that, I think I would have spent too much time being emotionally charged.
Right.
But by virtue of writing it all down, I feel like I was able to avoid, by focusing on every nuance of every detail, like what he was wearing, what he looked like, because I felt like I might have to give this as a deposition at some point. I want to get it all right. I think I avoided some very serious PTSD.
Right.
Seriously.
I think you did, and I think you experienced a situation that I think a lot of people say they're prepared to experience, and most people don't. We don't want to experience what you had to go through,
which in the end was nothing, if you think about it.
Right.
That's actually the weird part, but I don't think this story makes me look good at all.
Well, but at the time,
it all made sense.
It all made sense, and you have to make decisions real time. Like you don't have the fortunate ability to look at all the data points at that time, right? You're only able to glean what you can from, the situation as it's unfolding. And especially when you've got somebody who is, using substances, alcohol, drugs, whatever it may be, and, not being rational in their own right, you've got to make sound decisions to protect yourself, but also not to, do anything that you then regret and have, severe trauma over for the rest of your life, thinking, oh, I shouldn't have done that. There was guy was an accountant. He was just intoxicated. And,
almost killed somebody.
But I think, to your point, when you took the time to write down, all the details and remember the conversation and remember, hey, this is my house, and remember the confrontation as it was unfolding. To me, that would help to really codify this. This was a person who was trespassing, whose intent that you had no idea what that intent was at the time. And again, hindsight's 20/20, but you have to look at it when it's unfolding.
Well, now I've had, I don't know, maybe a week and a half of Navy SEAL training, so I feel very confident compared to where I was before. So that's quite a bit better. So let's talk a little bit about the media. And how bad they actually are with guns.
Right.
I know this is a personal pet peeve of yours and mine too. It is really abysmal. I just wrote down a couple of simple ones. First of all, like through and through shots. Like you always see people like jumping in. I was talking about Chris DeBeck about this at South by, and you'll see people jumping in front of somebody and it'll stop the bullet and instead of just going right through them and the person behind them and the 5 people behind them.
Right.
Like just nonsense. Like clearly no one was involved who actually knew anything about guns, because that's just not how guns work. Or glamorizing how easy it is to shoot. You'll see a lot of people like picking up a gun and they've never shot a gun before, and suddenly they are very proficient at it and shooting people. And it's like, that is very difficult to do.
Right.
And they're not even aiming,
Well, I not too long ago, I'm not going to say why I saw this on TV, but it was late one night, and Invasion USA with Chuck Norris from 1985 was on TV. And every bad guy in Invasion USA shot from the hip, shot a machine gun from the hip, which if you're not a shooter, you want to have that up on your shoulder. You want to be able to
control it, name it.
Control it, name it. If you're shooting a gun from the hip like Rambo, you can't accurately see where those rounds are going to go. Unlimited ammo.
That's got to be one of the most annoying ones to watch.
That really scares people too. It's like, oh my gosh, there's like a 20-minute shootout scene. Like
that wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes.
Well, and you and I have shot machine guns together.
Of course.
And so you know that a submachine gun, take an H&K MP5, can unload 30 rounds in 1.5 seconds. There is no 10 seconds worth of ammunition that you're just continuing to fire and fire and fire and fire and fire.
Right.
And I think when you see that in the movies, to your point, it looks easy. It looks like it's, anybody can pick it up, anybody can operate it. It's going to go where it needs to go. If you're a good guy, if you're a bad guy, you're going to miss your mark. And that's not realistic
At all. And I think it also adds a lot of fear for people. They're like, oh, that's what guns are like.
Right.
But they just aren't like that.
Right.
They really aren't. And they're also incredibly loud.
Right.
Is another thing that Hollywood just always gets this wrong. Like people are shooting indoors and they're fine. They can talk immediately. You wouldn't hear anything. Just beep.
Yeah, it's incredibly loud. And and going back to what we were talking about earlier with suppressors, suppressors not only reduce the sound signature, but they also reduce the recoil. So there's a whole argument that you could make that it makes a gun less jarring to shoot when you have it suppressed. But the sound, I think that is probably the thing, in my experience, when I have a first time shooter, the thing that surprises them the most is the sound of a firearm.
Yeah, they'll jump.
They'll jump, and that sound can vary widely, as you know. I mean, a 9mm compared to a rifle round, like a 5.56 millimeter, night and day. One is loud and one is really, really loud.
A lot of people will literally leave as soon as that starts happening.
Right.
They'll just walk out. Like, I can't handle that. Even with ear suppression, even with foams and the things over their ears, it's still too loud, too much concussion.
It's a very visceral experience when you shoot a gun. There is the sensation of the firearm going off, so there's a lot of movement and basic physics going on, and you can feel the concussion of the explosion going off in your chest a little bit. There's the sound, there's the smell of the gunpowder. There are a lot of things that are very when you see it on TV, all that's removed. You don't feel the recoil. You don't hear what the actual sound of the gun is like. But when you're doing it in a controlled environment, you do. And I think, to me, and I grew up shooting guns, but that's part of what that does is it commands respect. Commands respect of the gun, and that this is something that is a tool that can be used in a number of ways, right and wrong, but you have to know what you're doing, and it's a controlled explosion going off. That's basically what it is.
I remember one time I went shooting with a friend, and we were totally ill prepared and just kind of shooting out in the middle of the woods kind of thing or whatever. It was an actual range, but it was very uncontrolled. Just go out there and shoot kind of thing. And no one brought ear protection, so we just shoved like gum wrappers in our ears because we didn't have anything else. And I heard this high, like tinnitus, like beep sound for, at least the rest of the day. Yeah. Like it was very, very, very loud.
I mean, the decibels that you hear, I mean, it's akin to being front and center at a concert. I mean, it's loud, and hearing protection is something that's important, especially when you're in an indoor environment, indoor range as opposed to outdoor.
So let's talk about gun laws as they relate to criminal activity, because I think we've talked about it and how it affects the average everyday like shooter, but when we're talking about somebody who is out there actually attempting to rob a car or whatever, rob someone as they're coming out of an ATM or whatever, steal a car, let's say, these people are not necessarily people who give any credence at all to laws. They don't care because that's their business is crime. So there's a class of laws that might have a positive impact, like removing all guns might have a positive impact, but that means you have to remove them from the bad guys too. Right. So how are you going to go get those guns? Right. And meanwhile,
and how do you keep them out of the bad guys' hands? Right.
All the good people might deliver their guns to you that day, let's say, in a perfect world, but the bad guys are not going to because they don't care about your laws to begin with. So first of all, do you believe that there are any gun laws that exist or that could exist that really do a good job of targeting the bad guys in particular, as opposed to somebody who's just, a sportsman or somebody who's trying to defend themselves?
I think to answer that question, one of the things so as a federal firearms license
Yes,
holder.
you are a gun dealer.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm a gun dealer, and if I sell a firearm to you, I have to do a Form 4473 criminal background check, which is you're going to answer and say, if you've committed a felony, you've got to answer truthfully and honestly. You're going to get called out for that, and if you don't answer,
You mean that I've been caught for, or
well, that's a fine line. But let's assume that you've been arrested for that.
Sure.
From my standpoint, I want that background check to occur. I'm okay with that background check. I'm okay when people do it on me. I'm okay when we have to run it on other people. And I think there was an adjustment that I can't remember the exact year that we did it, but I want to say 20, 25 years ago, maybe even 30, we included people who had because the way it reads now, if you've committed a felony, you can't own or have a firearm. But what about if you were a jerk of a husband and abusive and abused your kids and your wife and had domestic violence misdemeanors? Because unfortunately that's a misdemeanor. Mm-hmm. But we changed the regulations to read that if you had committed crimes of domestic violence, if you were an abuser of your spouse, that also precluded you, just like a felony would, from owning a firearm. And to me, that was a very real reaction to not a made up problem, but a real problem whereby somebody could be a law abiding citizen, but if they have anger management issues and take that out on their family, or loved ones, you don't want that person, having a firearm because they're volatile.
Same thing with road rage. It seemed like that's a very similar class of.
Right.
Clearly, this person's unstable in certain situations.
Right.
They probably shouldn't have a gun, but how does that tie in with things like red flag laws, and how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, the problem I have with a red flag law is that you could, flag me and say, well, Grant's, got a whole shit ton of firearms that he owns.
He does.
Which I do. I have a lot of firearms.
For the audience, if you've ever seen that movie Tremors, where you see this big wall of guns, they have nothing on Grant.
I mean, I love my firearms. And you pointed this difference out earlier. I am a collector, whereas you may be a shooter, not a collector. I'm a collector.
Protector, as opposed
protector.
to... Yeah.
I'm a protector, but I'm also a collector. To me, firearms are art. Their engineering is beautiful to me and how they operate. And I have lots of firearms that just sit on the wall and get used once every couple of years, but it's because they're very, very special firearms to me. Mm-hmm. And
there's nothing wrong with that, by the way,
no,
or at least not from my perspective. But.
And I would agree with that because if you tried to label somebody who owned 100 guns as a lunatic, I don't think I classify as a lunatic. I'm just a firearms enthusiast.
Well, you are a lunatic, but in maybe other ways.
But more importantly, I haven't committed felonies. I don't have crimes of domestic violence. For all the NFA firearms that I own, I've gone through the appropriate background checks to make doubly sure that I with my fingerprints and passport photos, to make sure that I'm a person within good standing. And I think we want to have a baseline of requirements around owning a firearm. Now, to the efficacy of those requirements, and to your earlier point, does that really keep a person with bad intentions away from owning a firearm? Well, of course it doesn't. I mean, just the same way that making drugs illegal or having drugs be illegal, that doesn't stop the availability of drugs in our streets. You can walk out and get drugs, very easily. Mm-hmm. And I think people.
I mean, drugs are illegal, so why aren't they gone? I mean, if the idea is remove all guns from the United States, which I think a lot of people still legitimately believe is the right answer.
Right.
Well, start with drugs and see how that goes, and then get back to me.
I think that's a great sort of comparison to show, because with drugs, and certainly in the 80s when we saw this increase in drug usage and reclassification of drugs like cocaine to be felonies if you had that. Mm-hmm. It didn't stop the availability or demand for those drugs.
Or even just start with, if you're going to start with guns, start with the criminals first.
Right.
If the criminals can't have guns anymore and you've arrested thousands of them and there's no guns in possession, then I'll believe you that you can safely do this.
Right.
But that's just not the case.
It's just like, I mean, and I hate to keep using drugs as the example, but it's a fair example in that drugs are illegal. We're talking about narcotic drugs, illicit drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin. They're illegal. That doesn't stop their availability and usage within the U.S.
I think there is a lot of
or
confusion.
the world at large?
I think there's a lot of confusion in certain countries, like, well, we've done away with guns, but the United States is very strange.
Right.
First of all, we have a lot more of them.
Right.
And we also have a culture around them.
Right.
It's not just like a military thing where only people who've trained with them have them or have ever been exposed to them.
Right, right. And you take, countries like Australia, for example, which, 25 or so years ago had mass turn-ins where the government paid people for, their firearms, and they got rid of firearms. They were already highly regulated, and that they're very different than the U.S.
Very different.
Firearms are part and parcel to who we are, I think. And again, kind of going to the how easy it would be to put out a sort of, I just don't think there's feasibility in the U.S. of having people turn in guns. I don't think people would want to do that.
What about things like making sure things are locked up in your house, like saying you have to have some sort of childproof locks or some way to prevent them from being stolen from your house?
So again, you look at buying a brand new pistol, right? So if you buy a brand new pistol from me, it's going to come with a lock in that pistol case.
Yep.
And that is a federal requirement that gun manufacturers have to abide by, is they have to provide a way to lock that up. Now, I can tell you, I don't use that lock. I have a safe. My stuff's...
But let's say that there was carve-outs for that, safes or,
Right.
Locked vaults. All these things kind of provide the same sort of service, which is only the person who's allowed to be in there is in there.
Right.
Do you think that kind of law would be practical or good?
I think the practicality is the issue, right? Again, take a car, for example. You could say that if you drive a car over 100 miles an hour, that you have malintent, you're speeding, you're reckless, you're dangerous. Well, therefore, why do you need a car that goes faster than the speed limit, for example? But all cars go faster than the speed limit. We don't limit the speed of the car because of the risk associated with it. At some point people have to be responsible for the things that they own and the things that they use, and use them in the prescribed manner. And I think that's kind of what we take a look at the brace or take a look at some of these other things. That's what people kind of step back and look at, is that ultimately I'm a person who's responsible for myself, my own actions, and I should be able to determine what is safe and what is not safe. And I'll give you an example from my upbringing. So, I grew up in South Texas. In our house, we had and I have this in my house now, but we have a gun cabinet, which is where all our shotguns, all our rifles, all our handguns growing up were located. It was never locked in my house. But I grew up respecting firearms, and it was never something that I would never pull a firearm out and play with it or anything like that, despite what misconceptions may exist out there.
I had a similar upbringing. It wasn't so much a gun cabinet, but it was just, there were guns everywhere.
Right.
And it was a ranch, so it sort of made sense. People they shot things.
Right. And that was for us as well. We had a hunting lease. We were constantly, for us, that hunting and being outdoors was a way for my father and my sister and I to have fellowship, spend time. When you spend 5 hours in the morning with your father in a deer blind, you get an opportunity to have some, pretty cool conversations. And for me, that was part of being a Texan, part of growing up around firearms. But to the point of, my father didn't have a lot of, we didn't have locks on the guns, or there was trust. There has to be at some point that you trust.
But also you had a relationship where they told you that these are dangerous.
Right.
Well, you were trained on those guns as much as anyone in the family.
That's true. That's very true. I had to respect them. And if I ever displayed any improper gun safety techniques, like swinging the barrel around or anything like that when you're hunting for birds, I'd lose my privileges. Mm-hmm. And I think because I grew up not fearing firearms, just rather respecting them because they were tools and things that I wanted to use. And it was always painted as a privilege to me. And, first and foremost was safety. If you violate any form of safety, then you lose your privilege with the firearm.
I think that's definitely missing, is that sort of common sense training of kids. If you're going to have guns in the home, they have to at least know how to make sure they're unloaded, how to handle them in a safe way.
Right.
That's the very first thing when I've probably trained maybe 15 people now how to shoot. Always people who've never shot before,
right.
ever. And each time that I start with how to make sure it's unloaded.
Right.
Like that I don't start with how to start shooting and
Right.
start like, here's how to make sure it's unloaded. And then here's how to unload it. And now we'll talk about doing all the stuff you're interested in.
Right.
Because if you can't start there, the rest is just very dangerous.
Well, and I think the way in which you are exposed to firearms, and for me, we treated every firearm as if it was loaded and ready to rock and roll at any point. So the minute I had a firearm in my hand, until I, even when I checked to make sure there was nothing, no bullets in the chamber, it wasn't loaded. Like we still, you don't point it in the direction of anybody else. You always, you don't dry fire it. You don't. It's treated as something that can kill, because it can. So it's a very serious thing.
The way I've been told, and this is probably the best analogy I've heard, is like, okay, you take a gun, you unload it, it's absolutely perfectly safe, safety or whatever things you can do to make this thing safe, and then put it in a safe. Close the safe, walk out of the room, walk back into the room, unlock the safe, pull it out, and would you hold it to your head and pull the trigger? And even though you know exactly what happened and the fact that no one touched that gun, that just isn't safe.
Right.
And if you know how to handle guns, it doesn't even matter how well you have inspected the gun. If the second it's out of your sight, it's like, ooh, that is just too, I don't even want to think about what might have happened. And you know it couldn't have happened.
Right. But even then, you know that what you're dealing with is something that's very serious. And if you just don't take chances. I mean, you respect. And
yet, if we were to go to Wall Street and take bets on whether you die or not, obviously, a betting man would say, absolutely, take that bet. You're not going to kill yourself. You're fine. Go ahead, do it 100 times, do it 1,000 times. You're good to go.
Right.
And it's still something that you just wouldn't do.
I think it's something that becomes sacrosanct. It's something that it's ingrained in you that you don't use a firearm except for its intended use. I mean, just like the way in which, I don't know, pre your training or after your training, you don't put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to shoot. You always keep your finger off the trigger, so that you don't have an accidental discharge.
So there was 19,000 people murdered in 2020, 40,000 injured. By comparison, there was about 400,000 people who died of smoking. So we're at least 1 and maybe 1.5 orders of magnitude off, somewhere in there. Suicide was another 24,000 in 2020. So that is the bulk of the people who died actually died by their own hand. They were not shooting somebody else. They were shooting themselves.
Right.
So right there, that to me means that of all the issues we should be worried about, smoking is probably number one. COVID maybe has now taken its lead, but this is an issue that's kind of down the pipe. Might be 7 or 8 on the list of preventable deaths.
Right.
Why do you think this gets so much play? If those numbers, is it just because it is newsworthy, because it's interesting? Most of these deaths, by the way, were gang members shooting other gang members. This is not normal. This is not school shootings.
Right. And I think when you look at statistics even further, and you look at when there is an assault that occurs or a crime that occurs with a deadly weapon, that more than a firearm, it's a knife. It's an edged weapon of some sort that is used.
Or fists.
I mean, there are lots of, your fist can be just as deadly if used in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a tendency to glamorize firearms, and the light in which they're painted, is the hypocrisy that you see from a lot of folks in Hollywood who use guns in every firearm, every movie that they make, rather. But then they're outspoken.
Say a name. What were you thinking?
I'll say let's go with Mark Wahlberg, for example. For a long time, he was very anti-gun, but a lot of his movies, firearms left and right. Alec Baldwin. I mean, there's a great example. Probably a better example. Somebody who is very outspoken against firearms, yet uses them in the movies that he makes. So from my standpoint, it would seem that if you're going to preach from the pulpit, then you want you should follow your own preaching, and perhaps not be in movies that use firearms if you're against them. And you look, something that's been when you blow up the statistics, and I'm a numbers guy. I like empirical data, right? So
Me too.
When you take a step back and you say, all right, I want to use a scientific method. I'm going to approach this and look at all the data, and I want to see things at a macro level rather than a skewed maybe micro level. You see different things, right? You see that to my earlier point that knives, or your point, fists can be used in assaults, and people don't necessarily think about that when they think about a robbery, or think about a gun being used as the tool, as the weapon.
So an estimated 2.5 million crimes a year prevented with guns. 400,000 life-saving violent crimes are thwarted by guns. And of all of the deaths, only 611 were mass shooting.
So why do you think, and so those stats are powerful to me. Why do you think that we don't talk about atrocities that are prevented by people having firearms? We don't really tend, if you remember a year and a half or so ago, there was that church or attempted shooting in a church, and you had, a couple of the armed congregation members who were working security, were able to thwart this crazy guy with a gun. Mm-hmm. And you don't tend to hear a lot about those sorts of stories. You tend to hear a lot about the stories where, the gun is used in a nefarious way, but not where a gun is used to prevent some sort of crime from being.
This is actually probably one of my top two biggest beefs with the advertising world, the journalism world. The first is the advertising model, and then the second is this. It's the motto is, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
And they want to see some helpless young girl who's been cut in half by the whatever.
Right.
Because that is sensationalist in the way that gets people going, oh my gosh, that's terrible.
Right.
And they really want to tune into that. But if some bad guy gets thwarted from a crime, well, great. I mean, that happens thousands of times a day, literally.
Right. But we don't hear about that. It's not sensational. It's not,
because it doesn't bleed. And that was one of the few cases, it's funny you mentioned that, was one of the few cases where they did actually advertise that. And that particular story, I was shocked that actually made it to mainstream media at all. And I think it largely I think people kind of forgot that didn't fit their narrative.
Right.
And it sort of kind of leaked out, and then a bunch of other people picked it up, and then it was kind of more of a thing. But I don't think you're going to see that very often.
Right.
Like there might be, that might happen on a weekly basis, and we might only hear about it once a year.
But that's counter to the narrative that wants to be told, that
Sure.
the media wants to tell, right? So they don't want to, if they show that side of the story, then that undermines the argument that, all guns are bad, period, right? That, an armed, law-abiding citizen can impact a crime that's going on in a positive way and prevent that crime from happening.
There are so many amazingly awesome positive things that are happening in the world that will get zero coverage ever from a reporter.
Right.
They can't get it through their editorial committee because it won't sell any ads.
Right.
No one will ever click on it.
Right.
They don't care.
Right. Yeah.
That's terrible. I mean, this all comes down to this ad model. Because
Right.
if it really wasn't an ad model and people just wanted to write good, fluffy stories about how great the world is in any given moment, I mean, granted, there's bad things happening at this moment. I'm not saying that at all, but there's a lot of positive things that are happening around the world as well.
Right.
Extremely positive.
Right. Right. I don't watch the mainstream media news anymore.
I do when it's in the airport, kind of bored.
I like CBS Sunday Morning because they tell happy stories.
Occasionally, I will actually intentionally sit down and watch hours of a number of different news stations to see how they're handling any given.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think all of us who like to make our own decisions, who like to see the world through our eyes, and then make a decision on whether something is, just make a decision on what our opinion on that is. That's, we like to get our information from different sources, and then we may lean towards, Fox if we're, Republican, and
I mean, I think they're all just as bad.
They're all skewed.
They're extremely skewed, but all equally bad in the sense that they're all ad driven,
Right.
and that makes them push to certain directions, extremes. They're pushing certain narratives instead of just reporting the news.
Right.
You don't really see people reporting the news anymore.
Right.
They have everything's an editorial now.
Right. It's true. It's changed. It really has in the 50 years that I've been around, which is hard to admit, but it has changed.
So school shootings are that's the hot button.
Right.
That's the one where everyone says, okay, guns got to go. And the mainstream media uses this as the icon, the thing that everyone should be pointing their finger at. Like, we've got to stop this. Kids are dying, right? So before anyone thinks that I'm not empathetic about this, someone who's very close to me was in a school shooting. They did not shoot anybody. They were they were there when it happened. And this same individual also had one of their relatives held a gun to their head as well.
Wow.
So pretty horrible upbringing, as well as drug dealers being around and guns being present, but not in a positive way.
Right.
And like bad things are about to happen sort of sense. So this is an individual, this woman who has gone through the better part of her life being terrified of guns, literally just extremely squeamish for very good reason. I mean, I can't blame her at all for feeling that way. So we started going to the range specifically because she wanted to overcome it. She said, this is an irrational fear. The gun itself isn't the problem. It's the people who are causing this issue.
Right.
It took me 6 months of working with her before she could actually shoot an entire magazine by herself.
Wow.
And it was a big day when that finally happened. And, one magazine was it. It didn't go to two. But now she can actually go on her own, and it's desensitizing her.
Right.
And she's finally relaxing around it, and it's not as big a deal. It's not a splash of things that happen in her.
It's not a trigger, pardon the pun. But,
yeah, that's a good pun, actually. But I think if anyone's feeling like I am not taking this seriously, it's only because you don't know the people I know.
Right.
And I definitely feel for people who have gone through that, and I understand their pain. I'm just not sure that there is a credible solution to that problem.
Well, and I agree with you. And I also think about the role media plays in when we talk about news and their coverage of those sorts of events. I mean, prior to Columbine in Colorado, I can't think of a school shooting. That was the first school shooting that I became aware of.
And copycat crimes are a thing.
But copycat crimes are a thing. And if you look at the news, when you get mass coverage like that, and if you're somebody who is mentally deficient, having issues with depression and anger and things like, you're going to see, well, that's how I get people's attention. Everybody will listen to me then. And there has to be some responsibility that the media shares as well for not glorifying, that's not the right word.
Oh,
but
they sure do.
Maybe it is the right word then.
I think that's exactly what they do. They spend every waking hour analyzing it, and no news is even coming out yet. All they have is that some report, and all of a sudden choppers are on scene.
But to your point though, what can you do within the realm of being reasonable to prevent things like that from occurring? Right?
I mean, how do you have a law that both prevents innocent children from being mowed down by their classmates, and also allows 2.5 million crimes to be thwarted per year?
Right.
I just don't know that you get. It seems like it's really, really awful collateral damage that we just don't have a good solution for.
Well, unfortunately, these sorts of shootings aren't everyday occurrences. But they do happen, and when they do happen, it sells. It's a story that people are interested in. But I think the practicality of how you implement that becomes more difficult if you're trying to be realistic. And I'll be honest. When I go to my daughter's school, her elementary school, she's in first grade. There are armed guards there, which to me is way more disconcerting. I didn't have armed guards at my elementary school. And what sort of, what does that do psychologically to the children?
It's funny. I was thinking about this. People were like, well, we have like active shooter drills. And they're like, how horrible is that? And they spend a lot of time saying that it's terrible that they have to think about that. But I don't know if you had the same experience, but we had nuclear fallout drills when I was growing up. Yeah.
Everybody did. And that was, if you grew up in the 70s or 80s during the Cold War era, the height of the Cold War, that was part of it. I mean, again, it goes back to
we actually had a bomb shelter at our school.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, talk about a clear and present thought on your head. Every time you walk past it, you're thinking, that's where I'm going to have to go when the bombs drop.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, but you think about, go back in your time machine to the mid 80s, and you think about how the role of media, the role of Hollywood. I mean, there were lots of films, lots of movies and shows that were all about the Holocaust, all about, World War III happening and, nuclear Armageddon.
Mm-hmm.
That was a pervasive theme throughout the 80s. And when the USSR, when that collapsed, the Soviet Union collapsed, it changed the dynamic. And I don't know, I'd be curious as to your old school, if they still do drills for.
That's a good question. I don't know. It was a pretty rundown bunker. I don't know.
And probably, in all honesty, not an effective way of.
I'm just telling you, that's not going to do much against a nuclear
I'm
explosion.
I'm with you on that. It's the same way getting under your desk when you have a tornado. I'm not sure that does much, but
I think the 2x4s would have been toast. But yeah, it was pretty janky. So I want to kind of round this out and talking a little bit more about your product here. And I got to know, who do you think your customers are? Do you think your customers are, I mean, I was actually kind of curious, and I looked it up just because it's like, how is it possible you have so many customers, right? So there are 1.6 million persons living without a limb in the United States as of 2005. So this is kind of old stats, but say it's in that range. And there's an average of 8 guns owned per gun owner. So some people have 50 guns, some just have 1. So it does make sense that you could theoretically have a whole bunch of one-handed customers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's what's going on.
No, I don't either.
So then I was looking at the other possibility if you want to go down that path. And I also don't think this is true, but let's just go down the path. There could be a lot of people who are thinking, well, what if I get injured in combat? Wouldn't it be great to have a way to still use my gun if that were needed? If, let's say I hurt my hand or something, this is an alternative. At least I have some way to stay in the fight.
Right.
And that actually feels more plausible to me. I think there could be a lot of people thinking along that dimension. It's just a safety thing. It's just another feature of a gun that might be able to satisfy some sort of condition that I might find myself in.
Right.
That seems plausible. I don't think it's true, but it seems more plausible. Then there's this other thing, which is I think there's a whole lot of people who are just really don't like what the ATF is doing.
Right.
And feel that guns should look and operate more like an SBR. There's these PDWs that they sell, SIG for instance. They don't say how they're used. They don't even show photos of people shooting them.
Right.
They just describe them as a PDW with a brace. What is your feeling about your customers? If you were to like, put a finger into the wind and kind of guess what your average customer thinks about your product, what?
I think most of our customers, if not all of our customers, are law-abiding gun enthusiasts who may be drawn to the product because of the aesthetics, the way it makes the firearm look. It doesn't look all, quirky and, redundant safety devices put in place. It looks like it looks cool. It looks like it's a cool looking firearm. Mm-hmm. And I think there are a lot of people who are drawn to it by the aesthetics, but I think when they start to prosecute it further and think about the reality of a firearm with a 14-inch barrel versus a 16-inch barrel, mm-hmm. and realizing that it really, when it's all said and done, isn't going to matter doesn't really matter that much. I mean, it's in the minutia. It's only a deal if you make it a deal. And a belief that
or a slightly different weight or whatever, this crazy thing, 26 pages of nonsense.
And I think people push back when they feel like there's undue regulation or constraints that are placed by organizations in the name of safety. Because I think most gun owners realize that a gun is a gun. It's a deadly instrument. There's no doubt about that. And there's a point in which if you're going to allow people as citizens to own firearms, you allow them to own firearms. And I think there's a better use of resources to, regulate background checks, better use of resources to focus on gun education, shooting education. There are way more effective ways to spend our taxpayers' money, when it relates to guns and reducing firearms fatalities than controlling the look, the feel, the action, the operation of a firearm. I think we overlook the educational aspects. We overlook the opportunity to educate people and get them aware of gun safety, proper protocol. I mean, where's the federal program that talks about, so you're a firearm owner. Great. Here are the top 10 things you should need to know about gun safety. I mean, there seems like
these are things you could put in your product too, if you felt like it.
And these are things that, especially during the pandemic, when at the range, we saw so many firearms, a lot of firearms being sold to people who never owned firearms, but we were pleased to see that the follow through on the desire for training was very, very high.
So you offered it right then and there.
We offered it right then and there. And that uptake was very positive, and showed that people understood, now it's not everybody, but the vast majority of people that understood, even if they were anti-gun before and now moving into that pro-gun camp, that they need to know how to operate it safely. I think that's something, even if you're anti-gun, I think everyone should know, how to check and see if a firearm is loaded, unloaded, what safety means, what a safety on a gun means, basic rules, so that if you find yourself in a situation where, neighborhood kid pulls out a gun, you know what to do. You leave. That's what I would instruct my kids to do. Get out of there.
It's funny. I heard a joke that the ATF sounds like a corner store or something where you should be able to get alcohol, tobacco, and your firearm. I think that they have so lost on all three battles. Can you get alcohol? Yes. Can you get tobacco? Yes. Can you get firearms? Yes. Like they're such a failure of an organization in so many ways, and they're so hapless and so broken that I think your customers look at them as a useless organization and dislike what they've done.
Right.
If I were a betting man, if I were to go poll your customers, I think that they would not feel particularly kindly towards the ATF.
Well, and I think again, kind of going back to what I said with respect to the way a firearm looks, I think most firearm owners, just because a gun looks cool or looks more consistent with what you see on TV or the movies, that doesn't mean it's deadlier. It's just as deadly. A gun is a gun. And most people feel, if they're a firearm owner, that they should be able to make some degree of decisions on their own, right? You shouldn't have to prescribe to me every single detail of owning a firearm. I should be able to own them. I should be able to, have what I want as long as I use it lawfully.
I understand why they'd want quality.
Right.
It's like, well, this barrel has to be able to withstand these pressures,
right.
Or, something that, if you're talking about this public safety, which makes sense when you're talking about alcohol,
right.
I don't want something that's bathwater gin. It's going to make me go blind.
Right.
I don't want additives in my cigarette that's going to cause undue amounts of cancer. Of course, there is cancer for sure coming, but whatever. Beyond that, it seems like your customers would just say, look, you guys just don't know what you're doing. You don't know enough about guns to actually do what you're doing well. And you're trying to interfere with what they believe their Second Amendment right actually says, which is shall not infringe.
Right. Yeah. And that shall not infringe, I think is the crux of it, right? I mean, people don't want to feel impaired or overly regulated when it comes to things that are afforded by the Constitution or amendments thereof.
Grant, I want to thank you for coming in.
Well, thank you, Robert.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. We've talked about a lot here, and I am sure we're going to have questions and stuff popping up. I am sure we've missed a lot because this is such a deep topic. I was talking with Chris outside, and I think we both said that this is going to be one of the harder ones we go through. Because of how deep it is, how complex it is.
It is complex, but it's also, I think, part of our heritage, and it's something for me. I've enjoyed firearms. It's been been a great place for me to hang my hat, kind of a second era of my career. And I'm doing something that I like. I'm doing something that people like, that they feel they're interested in. Nobody was interested in software. I mean, at least not at a friend level, but people are interested in this. And I think the fact that we don't have enough intelligent discourse going on, I think that's more of a danger than anything else. I think we should be able to have conversations, regardless of what side of the equation you're on. We should be able to have conversations that are based on facts that are, let's understand each other, and not get polarized by either you have to be pro-gun, anti-gun. I don't think that shoe fits everyone necessarily anymore.
You're here. So where can people find you?
You can find me at the range. I love to shoot.
Come on down.
Just come on down. I think you can find me at the range. You can follow me on Instagram at Gunshaw. I tried to go for Gun Show. That's the reality behind that. But I ended up going with Gunshaw, which is my last name.
Actually,
so
I think it works better.
It works better, I think.
so.
I agree with you. So hit me up at Gunshaw and let me know if you have any thoughts, comments. I love to talk about this stuff. It's my passion.
Thank you so much for coming.
Of course, Robert. Thank you.